And I'm right at 5 o'clock. Carl, should we start?
I'll let you know here. It's coming live right now. Once this pops up here, we are live. We can go.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Wes Mcneese. I'm the Executive Director for Diversity Initiatives, the SIU system. And this evening, we will be discussing in our conversation of understanding strategies and actions for dismantling systemic racism. This is going to be a 2-hour virtual conversation. And it's for the Southern Illinois University system, but also for our extended audience. And this conversation is being sponsored by the President's Office, SIU, and also the system's Diversity Advisory Council. This conversation will be a kickoff to Diversity Day at SIU Edwardsville, beginning tomorrow, October 15 at 8 a.m. You are encouraged to attend and to register at siue.edu/diversity. We have put together a panel of institutional and student leaders who will give their thoughts about this evening's topic, and then you will be invited to ask them questions and or make comments. And our panelists this evening are Dr. Dan Mahoney, the SIU System President, Dr. Austin Lane, the Chancellor, SIU Carbondale, Dr. Randy Pembroke, Chancellor, SIU Edwardsville, Todd Bryson, the Interim Associate Chancellor for Diversity, SIU Carbondale, Dr. Vanessa Brown, Associate Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer, SIU Edwardsville, Dr. Wendy Elamine, Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, SIU School of Medicine, Fabiola Lopez, a junior majoring in business and Spanish, is also president of the International Student Council Club, SIU Edwardsville. Joining us also is Travis Folk, a fourth-year medical student and co-president, the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association, and co-organizer of the Marginalized Student Network, SIU School of Medicine. Dr. Nilanjana Bardhan is Professor of Communication Studies, SIU Carbondale, and she will be our moderator. Dr. Prince Wells is an Associate Professor of Music, SIU Edwardsville, and will monitor questions from the audience. Carol Baker is our Zoom coordinator. Helping us out tonight is Kelly Wickham Hurst. She is an organizer and workshop facilitator for Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training, and she will make opening comments. Kelly.
Thank you, Dr. Mcneese. Thank you for having me. I have just gotten off of a full day of training, and so I'm still in the same mindset to get us started. One of the things that we do in our organizing work is work with institutions and talk to them about moving through some stages on a continuum. And if you will permit me, I am going to share my screen so that you all can take a look at this continuum. It is, do you all see that okay?
Yes.
So we use this particular continuum to ask institutions where it is they are on the continuum. And we allow institutions and people from the institution to take a look at this and determine for themselves where they are. One of the things that we don't do is tell people where they are. When we do this continuum exercise, we are also really clear about what the stages mean. If you look at stage 1, it is actually a stage that if you are getting any federal money is illegal. That doesn't mean that some institutions are not still operating illegally in 2020, because they are. You can have, for example, a country club that can do all kinds of discriminating against people and make decisions as to who gets to come in. If you look through stages 2, 3, and 4, we're going to talk about those for just a few moments. But I also want you to note that in stage 5, the very top one says you cannot do this work alone. So even as the ecology of SIU can't do this work all by themselves, they have to be connected to other institutions that are also doing this work. And then when you look at stage 6, Stage 6 tells us that this is a vision. We are hopeful that someday we will get there. Before I move to the next screen, I want you also to notice that between stages 3 and 4 is a very dark, wide black line. And there is a reason for that. It is not a mistake. It is because moving from stage 3 to stage 4 on the continuum is the hardest one to do. The reason that it's hard is because when we get very comfortable with how our institutions are operating and we begin to move forward, we get pulled back. And we do that because it's a very comfortable place to be. We may be dissatisfied with what's happening, but we are also risk averse. We don't want to make any mistakes in our institutions. And we will manage conflict instead of allowing the conflict to happen so that we can address it. And when we do that, it actually impedes our conversations around anti-racism. So what I would like for you to see next is exactly how you can move. And thinking about how we move means that we have to think about what these stages mean. So if you are in a stage 2 and what you are trying to do as an institution is move to a 3, here are the strategies, and they're very specific strategies that can be employed to get you to move. In stage 2, one of the things that happens is many people say, we do not have a problem. This is not an issue. We don't even have to address this. And part of what you have to do in that stage is to frame it as such and talk about the impact of it. Since we are speaking to a lot of doctors on this call, one of the things that we absolutely know is that the whole we don't have a problem really came to fruition this past year. And what we have seen is that in predominantly communities of color have been disproportionately impacted through COVID, and also with education, and also with food, and also with transportation. And so all of those systems that are operating in this particular stage that are still continuing to say we don't have a problem are also not addressing it. You also have to think about who the stakeholders are in these institutions as a way to move forward. A strategy is to be thinking about not just how do we increase diversity, but also how do we maintain diversity? Institutions do a fantastic job of recruiting. Institutions also do a very poor job of retaining. And so often what we hear from institutions is, well, we've recruited them, they come here, but they just cycle through and they don't stay. And that is an opportunity for the institution to listen to why it is that people don't stay. You also have to identify some of these ways that systemic racism is a huge, huge chasm between what we intend and what the impact is. And you have all heard that intention is far less important than the impact. The impact, or how it lands on human beings, is what we need to be listening to. One of the things we do in a stage 2 is we waste a lot of time arguing about the difference between intent versus impact. And we want to say that wasn't our intention. And what we would suggest is that malice is actually not required to do harm. In fact, I would suggest that most of the harm that I've even experienced in the United States has probably come from a really good place. I don't believe most people intend to harm. I don't believe most institutions intend to harm. However, the impact of how it lands on human beings is really what we need to be considering. That last bullet point you see there is, I will have to say that for the very first time in my life, I am seeing a critical mass. And maybe you have too. This is the summer of uprisings in the United States. Uprisings led by predominantly people of color, and uprisings led predominantly by youth, who are finally saying, hey, there is something we have to do about this. We cannot sustain this. It is not a sustainable way for us to live in this country, especially with all of the harm that's been done, not just the generational harm of race and racism, but also the current chronic harm of the ways in which we're doing this. So I just want to acknowledge that even doing it in this space, in this way, is very, very odd. That we're not together. We are not in one room all together so that we can do this work. Moving on from stage 3 to 4, if you are an institution that is in 3 and wants to move to a 4, then you've got to start to live into the ambiguity. What most institutions want to do is have the right answer right away. And what most institutions also do is not have the right answer and then become absolutely paralyzed with movement and not moving at all because we're so afraid of getting it wrong. But while we're celebrating diversity in that particular stage, we are not yet appreciating diversity. We might celebrate it, but not see it for the benefit that it is, even though all of the research that we have heard from around diversity says that the more diverse an institution is, the more diverse a community is, the more thriving that community is when we can learn to appreciate the diversity that we have. It also is engaging in some anti-racist practices, meaning what we're doing is we're having conversations that are courageous. And we are moving to places where we are providing action for some of the things that we're naming and not just, as I like to say, admiring the problem. We do a very good job of admiring this problem without thinking about how we're going to do some action around it. You're also going to begin advocating for some intentional anti-racist assessment, thinking about what is it that our institution has, who can we bring in to do this work to say exactly what it is we need to hear and not what we want to hear. But you also begin leveraging that critical mass. I want to be really clear about critical mass. All the research tells us that critical mass is far less than people assume that it is. It is not 90% of the institution. It's not even 75% of an institution. A critical mass can be 15% of the people in your institution. And I think of it this way. I have heard this often in many of the institutions I've worked in, which is this. Well, we've got to make sure that everyone's on board. Have you all heard that before? We have to make sure everyone's on board. And yet, we also know that there are all kinds of policies that are in our institutions that I was not on board for, that no one asked me about, and that I completely disagree with. So thinking about that critical mass means we're going to ask for people who are ready to do this work. We are not going to waste any time from stage 3 to 4 by worrying about the people who are far, far behind and want to maintain status quo. We're going to take the people who are ready to make that change now that we have critical mass. You also need to name some sort of ad hoc group. If you don't name a group, then it becomes no one's job. If Dr. Mcneese, for example, in his title that he shared a moment ago, if he is the only person who is responsible for the diversity efforts, then nothing else will be changed. He is to lead it, but everyone has to understand that this ad hoc group is there to support and there to help drive these changes that we need. And finally, let's look at living in stage 4. One of the things we know about our institutions is that they are not accountable, nor have they historically been accountable to people of color. They have been accountable to whiteness, to white society and dominant white culture, and that's where changes get made. But when we are living into our actual values, we are finding ourselves being accountable to the people who are harmed the most. I also say it this way: when we take care of the least, the people who are the most marginalized, the people who are the most harmed, we are actually ending up taking care of everybody. So focusing our efforts on that is one of the things that is going to help us. You're also increasing what that critical consciousness is when we think about who is at the table and who is making decisions, but also what are our policies? What are our practices? What are the procedures that we have put in place that have somehow been harmful to people? And why are we continuing to keep those policies and practices and procedures in place when we know the harm is being done? You're also deepening an analysis or thinking about how critically conscious you have to be in order to think about race. That it is not something that is an add-on, it is not an addition, it is foundational to our work. Often what we hear people say is, we have to dismantle the isms in our institutions because someone mantled it. Someone built it up. And how it got built up doesn't really matter. But how we tear it down means that we have to do this work together if we're going to live in our values in this way. And thinking about this as a strategy of thinking of who is the next person I'm going to talk to about this. It is not going to be someone with a closed door. As a matter of fact, a really good strategy is only knock on an open door. People who have closed doors to this particular conversation are not only going to not do the work, they're actually going to stop the work. And by the time we get to living out our values in stage 4, we have a deep commitment to doing equity work in a way that has not been seen previously. We also have to resource and fund it. Equity work is not free, nor should it be. In fact, we have spent in this nation centuries extracting resources, harming people, and taking from all kinds of communities in ways that have financial impacts. And if we can afford to have done that, then we can afford to put back into those communities. We can afford to listen to and respond to the people of color to whom we need to be accountable because they have been harmed the most. And finally, we're going to continue to just grow and build our capacity. When we're building capacity, when we are ensuring that everybody is on the same page because we have a shared language, we have an understanding of a framework around race and racism that everyone is able to talk about, then living in stage 4 becomes a far easier place to go. So what I'm hopeful for is that this will set up the conversations that you all will be having in thinking about where it is we want to go. But we also have to ask, where is it that we currently are? What stage are we in? And what are the strategies we want to begin to employ so that we can move to the next particular stage? So Dr. Mcneese, I'm going to turn it back over to you and ask, before I go, if you have any questions that you want me to clarify.
Is there anyone on the panel who has a question for Mrs. Hurst? Then Kelly, I will thank you for these expert messages. Mrs. Hurst will not be able to stay with us through the remainder of our conversation, but Dr. Barnum is poised and she's ready to lead us through. Dr. Barton, would you please take over?
Thank you, Dr. Mcneese. And thank you to everybody, the panelists, as well as the people who have tuned in today for joining us for this important conversation. My name is Nilanjana Barden again, and I'm a professor of communication studies on the Carbondale campus. So once again, our focus today, our topic is strategies and action for dismantling systemic racism, and more specifically, how we can and are engaging in that work at SIU. Now, there's decades worth of evidence in research as well as in practice that no society or organization can succeed in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion without leadership support. So today, we have leaders from all 3 campuses, students as well as administrators, who will offer their views and explain how they're personally involved in efforts to dismantle systemic racism at SIU on all 3 campuses, that is. So just a few notes about how we will proceed today. Each panelist will speak for about 3 minutes on their subtopic within our larger topic today, and they will also sort of explain in about 3 minutes what work they are personally doing and what to dismantle systemic racism. So we will first start with our president, with President Mahoney, and then we will move on to Chancellor Pembroke, and then to Chancellor Lane. And then next, we will have those who are leading the diversity, equity, and inclusion work on the 3 campuses. So from the School of Medicine, we have Dr. Wendy L. Amin, and then we will have Mr. Todd Bryson from the Carbondale campus, and then we will have Dr. Vanessa Brown from the SIUE campus. And then we will have our student leaders, Mr. Travis Falk from the School of Medicine, and then Ms. Fabiola Lopez from the SIUE campus. So while our panelists are speaking to the audience, please go ahead and send us your questions, and we will start addressing those once they're done with their short presentations. And once the panelists start speaking, they will tell you very briefly what it is that they're focusing on. So we will start with President Mahoney. Over to you, President Mahoney.
Thank you. And I'll talk about today, and it actually leads well from the presentation we just had. I've talked a lot and written a lot about recruiting for diversity. But as Ms. Hirsch talked about, one of the problems we have is a retention issue of actually having people stay and move through the system. And I'm going to focus specifically on the tenure and promotion process for faculty, which I think has a lot of issues with it. Much of it, as she talked about, unintentional and actually sometimes seeking clarity where perhaps clarity isn't the best choice because it leads to some of these biases. So if you have been through a tenure and promotion process for faculty, there's really three parts of it: teaching, research, and service. And each one of them has some issues with it. So we start first with teaching. Teaching often relies very heavily on teaching evaluations. Now we do that despite we have research out there that indicates that teaching evaluations tend to be biased against pretty much every group except for white males. So there tends to be bias in the process of doing teaching evaluations. And then we use them, sometimes even use a numerical value. So in order to get tenure, you must average, say, 4.0 and above on a scale of 1 to 5 on teaching evaluations. And when we've done that, we now have given an excessive amount of weight to those teaching evaluations, and particularly the numbers associated, as opposed to the comments, which sometimes may be more valuable in really assessing the quality of the teaching. In the research area, we look both at numbers of publications, but also then we try to assess the quality of those publications. And again, we tend to go with numbers because we feel safer with numbers. So we'll look at impact factors of journals, acceptance rates of journals, citations. Some places will classify journals as A journals and things like that in order to provide, again, some clarity in the process. Once again, we tend to have problems. Many of our faculty of color are doing research in new and emerging areas, which sometimes means they're publishing in journals that do not have the higher impact factors or lower acceptance rates, so they're seen as not having the same quality. And again, we use those acceptance rates and impact factors to determine what an A journal is, as opposed to perhaps saying we want to do more research on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and therefore journals that focus on that maybe should be our A journals because we want to encourage publications in those areas. Similarly, with citations, that tends to value some areas over others. And I actually can use myself as an example. I've done research both on sport marketing and consumer behavior, as well as equity in sport organizations. My top 10 cited articles are all from the sport, consumer, and marketing area. And in fact, my top article there has 8 times as many citations as my work in equity does. I will say both are probably of comparable quality, but the one is cited significantly more. Now, if I'd never done the sport consumer side and just on the equity side, my research record would look significantly less quality and less valuable. And that would hurt me in a tenure promotion process. The third area is service. And this is an area we often see as, again, an issue for faculty of color. One is that they're often asked and seen from students as advisors that go beyond the normal work of most advisors. So they're seen as a support. People go to them a lot more often. And that becomes very hard to document as part of a tenure and promotion process. But we know that faculty of color often have to do more of that type of work with students outside the classroom, and that impacts them in other ways. We also are seeking, in the best of intentions, of having diversity on all of our search committees, on all of our committees. And if we don't have a lot of faculty of color, that means we go to the same people multiple times. So they end up doing an excessive amount of service compared to the average faculty member. The problem is, as we go through often tenure and promotion processes, we treat each 3 of those as distinct. So the faculty of color says, yeah, outstanding in service, but your teaching and research weren't as strong, in part because you were spending so much time in service, but we don't weigh that into that decision-making process. So in each area, we can have some problems. And some of this is, I think, and again, an overemphasis on numbers, as opposed to really a subjective evaluation of the quality of the faculty members' work during the time that they're here. So we then again find faculty of color sometimes have more problems going through tenure and promotion processes. And even if they're successful, the way we've set the system up has made them feel devalued. So back to that issue of retention, even if they're successful or able to get through the process, they don't feel their work is as valued because of all those different factors I just talked about. I do think this is one area where it really is everyone needs to be engaged, at least every faculty member needs to be engaged, because we set up a lot of tenure promotion policies really at the discipline level. And so this is, a lot of people have asked me, how can I get involved? If you're a faculty member, you can get involved by looking at the tenure promotion processes in your area and the factors you're using. And have you done things that really weigh against faculty of color? Again, often unintentionally, often to see clarity, but have a real impact on our ability to retain those faculty that we've recruited.
President Mahoney, we will now move on to Chancellor Pembroke.
Thank you. I want to say that how much I appreciate Dr. McNeese and President Mahoney for setting up the conversation this evening. And Dr. Barden, thank you for moderating. I also would say thank you to the fellow panelists for spending time on this important topic tonight. Like the others you will hear from, I've been asked to identify a best practice for dismantling systemic racism in higher education institutions. I chose creating excellent and equitable university retention and graduation rates across all student groups, particularly historically underrepresented groups. Everyone deserves a chance at their dreams to be a teacher, a nurse, an engineer, a doctor, a dentist. These careers cannot happen without a college degree. And so we are currently dedicating ourselves at SIUE to this task, increasing retention and graduation. Black students at SIUE are retained from their freshman to sophomore years at about 10% lower percentage rate than the overall freshman student population. Six-year graduation rates are between 20 and 25% lower for Black students compared to the student population overall. So we, like many other institutions, have work to do to address this situation, a situation that Gloria Ladson-Billings refers to as an educational debt. Not debt in terms of tuition and fees accumulated along the way, but rather an institutional obligation, a cultural commitment to equity. There are several things we need to address this, including looking at financial support for underrepresented and first-generation students, many who are Black and Latinx. The SIU System Commitment Scholarship is a great start, as is new GEARS funding from the governor and the state of Illinois. These allow us to offer completion scholarships for students in their senior year, for example. Another important element is to use test-blind processes for admission and scholarship support, a step that the SIU system is now employing. And I know Chancellor Lane will address this in just a moment. Mentoring is an additional key, both student mentors as well as faculty and staff mentors. This can be particularly helpful if the individual mentors come from the student's academic area of interest. Also, early alert systems. We use a product called Starfish so that students, advisors, faculty, and administrators know quickly if a student is struggling. Feeling welcome is also a key. So we have initiated beginning of the year receptions to identify faculty and staff mentors. We've created affinity-based celebrations at important points such as graduation. And we've created a virtual diversity day, at least virtual this year. And that is happening tomorrow. So I encourage you to check out our website and be a part of that. Particularly in the age of COVID, logistics are important and tech support. So through the GEARS funding that I mentioned before, we're trying to provide laptops and to provide hotspots so that people can access the internet. Our goal is to create student success at comparable rates. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Pembroke, and for your thoughts on that particular subtopic. We will now move on to Chancellor Lane from SIUC, the Carbondale campus.
Well, thank you, and good evening to everyone, and it's good to see some familiar faces. I want to thank as well Dr. Mahoney and Dr. Pembroke, Dr. McNeese, all the panelists, Dr. Barden, thanks for all you do. It's just so refreshing to have these conversations after being in higher ed for a long time, it feels like, and not having talked about any of this. And so it's really refreshing to be able to almost debrief a little bit. So I'm really thankful to have these conversations. I'm going to be talking about the elimination of the ACT and the SAT requirements for incoming students. So I'll talk a little bit about test optional, and then I'll introduce a new topic that I think many of our institutions are moving towards. And so as you may or may not know, the SAT and the ACT has long been criticized for being culturally biased, for negatively impacting our students of color, our students with disabilities that may come from low-income families, further perpetuating systemic racism in higher education. And it's simply not the best predictor of success. And I'm living proof of that. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. As a result, here at SIUC, and you're seeing this at SIUE, hats off to all the institutions that are moving in this direction. You know, we changed our admission policy. Here at the university, we changed it last spring and became a test optional university. To date, just to level set here, there are approximately 1,700 plus accredited, and I want to underline the word accredited, four-year colleges and universities with SAT, ACT optional testing policies for the fall of 2021. So this movement, it's so refreshing to see this movement, given that the anxiety that exists with the number of students that are taking these entrance examinations, is causing them and their families so much anxiety. So it's really refreshing to see this movement. This past fall, we gladly, and I'm going to underline again, gladly accepted our first class of freshmen with our test optional policy. Under this test optional policy, colleges like ours, we still welcome test scores from students who choose to submit them. However, we took it a step further this fall in our discussions. And so beginning next fall, we will move to being more of a test blind institution. And we're seeing a test blind movement out there as well as it relates to merit-based scholarships. And this is what I think is going to be key, and it's going to be a game changer. Our students will be given credit for their academic work over 4 years instead of a 4-hour or 5-hour standardized test. Our scholarships will be awarded based on their academic GPA, not their test score. And that's critical. And just to provide some context here, if a school is test blind, it means that they will not consider standardized testing at all. This movement, as they're calling it, test blind movement, represents a sea change in college admissions and awarding of scholarships. Prior to this year, only a few colleges were actually test blind. In the 7 months since COVID's emergence, here in the US, we're beginning to see several more colleges and universities making that move, not only from being test optional, but actually being test blind. And so I'm really refreshed in seeing that. So you can see how committed we are to dismantling systemic racism. My own personal story keeps the chip right on my shoulder. I remember being a high school senior, which now feels like many, many, many years ago, and having discussions with my friends about how scared we were to take the SAT and the ACT. We were petrified. We were underprepared. We didn't have the money to take any SAT, ACT prep courses and those kind of things. We didn't have that kind of money. And we wondered why the stakes were so high. And we all had pretty decent GPAs and class ranks, but none of us were happy with the results of the test and how they controlled how far we could go in life, or how it actually placed us in a box that defined us as not being college ready. Unlike many of my friends that gave up because they believed the test was right in determining their future, I decided that it would not determine mine. And so as you can see, we are firmly committed in making sure that we dismantle systemic or dismantle systemic racism to ensure that we give our students every opportunity to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lane. We will now move to Dr. Wendy L. Amin from the School of Medicine.
Good afternoon. Today, I wanted to at least give you all an opportunity to understand some of the tactics that we're using at SIU School of Medicine, especially on our anti-racism task force. We're focusing on 4 primary areas, and that's metrics, training, organizational analysis, and policies and procedures. But today, I wanted to take some time to illuminate one of the strategies that we have been embarking upon since 1972 that really highlights one of our signature programs. It was one of the reasons why I came to SIU School of Medicine, and that is our MedPrep program. MedPrep is a program that has existed since 1972 to make sure that it is addressing the opportunity gap. I don't like to use the word achievement gap because I think that it places the onus on an individual as opposed to understanding that certain individuals have just not had the opportunities. And that's what racism does. It prevents people from having the same access to opportunities, whether or not it's healthcare, education, or any of the social issues that get in the way of them being able to become their best selves. So the MedPrep program is a 2-year program for students who have graduated from college. It provides an opportunity for students who have been either educationally disadvantaged or economically disadvantaged. It's focusing also on first generation graduates. And this has been a feeder, not just for Southern Illinois University School of Medicine to increase the numbers of underrepresented students in medicine, but also nationally. It has produced over 1,200 physicians nationally. And I think that many people are not aware of the impact that we're having, especially during COVID. Many of those individuals are out there working right now to make sure that we're also focusing on health disparities. Dr. Lane talked about going to test optional. Medicine has not made it there yet. However, we do have something called holistic review. And that's making sure that when students apply to our medical school, that there's an opportunity for their metrics to be looked at, but also their experience and their other attributes that will make them physicians that are culturally competent. So the strategy that I wanted us to be aware of is that the pipeline programs are a key opportunity for us to make sure that we are reducing the opportunity gap. Dr. Mcneese recently, probably 12 years ago, started a physician pipeline program, and that's a program for 9th through 12th graders. So we're starting to reach down deeper. I think people think sometimes that you become a physician in 4 years. However, I believe it really starts in kindergarten, and we have to make sure that we are providing people with those opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Alameen. We will now move on to Mr. Todd Bryson from the Carbondale campus.
Hello again, my name is Todd Bryson. I'm the Interim Associate Chancellor for Diversity at SIU Carbondale. And my topic tonight is anti-bias training for search committees. Unfortunately, universities cannot assume that everyone who serves on a search committee prioritizes the importance of hiring diverse faculty and staff. If we are serious about our commitment to faculty and staff diversity, we must make a concerted effort to educate everyone who serves on search committees. Although search committees is a small part of the hiring process, we will not be able to diversify our campus without the members of the search committee eyes being open to their various biases, assumptions, stereotypes that influence their perceptions, judgments, and decisions. At SIU, we are addressing bias and discrimination with 3 distinct audiences, each with their own role in the employment process and ways that they can reduce the impact of discrimination. The largest audience and the majority of the scheduled trainings is search committee members. Anti-bias and implicit bias training is required for all people who will serve on a faculty or AP search committee before they begin reviewing applications. The training addresses such topics as interpreting the qualifications and identifying the qualifications of applicants' resumes and cover letters, and their type of questions that they can and cannot ask during an interview. Attendees learn about SIU status as a federal contractor and what is required of us as an employer. They receive guidance on best practice in fair selection and how to identify and reduce the effect of unintentional bias. They learn ways to communicate with applicants to keep them interested and engaged in the process. The second focus audience is the university administrators. In this training, SIU deans, chairs, directors, and others learn best practices for reducing bias and discrimination in the foundation of search in the search process. The preliminary steps that can cause bias. Administrators will learn how to write appropriate minimum qualifications and position descriptions for vacancies. They learn ways to use a job announcement as a sales pitch to interest readers in applying, especially ways to market SIU as a desirable place to work. As a university, we need to work toward recruiting applicants rather than just advertising as a vacancy, hoping that someone applies. Administrators set the tone and expectations for this practice and are best positioned to set budgets for advertising and salary offers. Administrators also learn what to look for in search committee members and how to effectively manage and search process with regard to bias and discrimination. They learn how bias can influence salary offers, startup funds, and other benefits, and why we should work to avoid letting those things happen. Finally, there are sessions for support staff. These are sessions that are geared toward the behind-the-scenes help that make a search process more fair and more successful. They learn about record keeping and communication practices, especially ways that they can reduce bias with applicants in the phone calls and email conversations. They learn ways to help quality control of the paperwork and search process, such as fair, non-discriminatory disposition codes. Applicants are often comfortable asking staff members questions they would not ask a committee in an interview, things that they would reveal protected class information, but are important to the applicant's decision to accept the job at SIU Carbondale. The support staff sessions discuss why it's important to try to answer those questions, why it's important to keep the questions and information they reveal confidential from the committee, and the importance of keeping reference files for answers to common questions, such as contact information for local mosques, synagogues, Catholic churches, location of barbers, salons, experience with natural hair, disability-friendly venues, vegan, vegetarian, halal, and kosher restaurants, etc. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson. Thank you for explaining the importance of anti-bias training for these search committees, which are responsible for hiring, faculty and staff on these campuses. That was very helpful. We will now move on to Dr. Vanessa Brown from the SIUE campus.
Thank you. My topic today is education and training. And I wanted to spend a little time on just talking a little bit about the things that we're doing at SIUE. So education and training is critical to making a paradigm shift, to becoming an anti-racist institution. As a system, we are committed to eradicating systemic practices that are barriers to equity, diversity, and inclusion. As a member of the SIUE community, we have undertaken a number of educational opportunities for students, staff, and faculty to ensure access to new knowledge and truths to become the university we believe that we can be for all people. It is time for truth and true commitment to social justice. Early this summer, SIUE made the step by developing an anti-racist task force led by our Chancellor. We dove into the color of law as a team. We watched the 3 episodes of Race, the Power of an Illusion. We embraced and owned our miseducation and vowed to take steps to ensure our students, staff, faculty, and surrounding communities would be given opportunities to learn the true American history, inclusive of all of its injustices, in hopes that our hearts would be changed, new relationships developed, and current policies and procedures and practices would be examined and abolished. Some of our educational training opportunities at SIUE are, yes, Diversity Day, and our Chancellor talked about that, where we dialogue through engagement sessions, alumni panel, international panel, and a host of updates on our diversity and inclusion strategic plan. In fact, this conversation is the kickoff of our 3rd annual Diversity Day beginning tomorrow. Our School of Education, Health and Human Behavior has started the Dream Collective, a series of panels and conversations on anti-racism designed to name, address, and dismantle racism through education, advocacy, and mobilization. Our Women's Studies have conversations with cool women and a number of other educational events. SIUE's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center, led by our interim assistant provost, Dr. Jessica Harris, are offering a series of anti-racism workshops. Our Department of Political Science has a number of webinars focusing on systemic racism. Our Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion celebrates the different heritages of our campus and the world, and provides brave spaces through inclusive conversation and sustained dialogues. The Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion is providing diversity learning, utilizing Diversity EDU to campus units such as intercollegiate athletics, the police department, admissions, human resources, just to name a few. The university has committed to a number of signature events, such as diverse student welcome receptions that our Chancellor talked about, our Martin Luther King Luncheon, which has been around about 37 years, Diversity Day, Diversity Inclusion Spring Summit, which started with the Black Lives Matter Summit in response to Ferguson and the death of Michael Brown. Educational culture tours, linking SIUE to the region, For example, the Elijah B. Lovejoy Library, Lincoln to Alton, the Lincoln Presidential Museum, Lincoln to a number of our professors who are Lincoln scholars, and a tour to Brooklyn, Illinois, the first Black town led by our own Prince Wells, who was born and raised in Brooklyn, and our cultural graduation celebrations. All of these events are designed to create dialogue around tough conversations and at the same time celebrate the uniqueness of our cultures and the location of our campus. I am sure the other campuses are providing some of the same opportunities. So I encourage all of you to get involved with learning new knowledge, developing new relationships, addressing barriers to equity, and most importantly, find a safe space to have a brave conversation. We'll see you at Diversity Day tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, and thank you, all of you, our administrators and leaders from all three campuses who have shared such really good details, concrete details about what SIU is doing as a system to stay with the trends right now in higher education to make our systems more equitable. So what we'll do now is we'll move on to our student leaders, and we'll first go to Mr. Travis Falk from the School of Medicine.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'd like to talk about mandated cultural sensitivity and competency training tonight. As mentioned earlier, I'm one of the co-organizers of the Marginalized Student Network at SIU School of Medicine. The Marginalized Student Network was created by the leaders of the student groups on campus that represent marginalized students. So we represent the LGBTQIA+ community, women of color, the Latinx community. And so we all wanted to come together and just kind of combine our voice and combine our power. We created a document that we shared with the SIU system administrators. And the first thing on that document was in reference to mandated training, like I've mentioned. This training, we believe, should be required by and provided to all students, staff, faculty, and administration. And it would be used to, define culture, racism, micro and macro aggressions, and implicit and explicit biases. We wanted to give historically accurate descriptions of marginalization against specific groups, including but not limited to people of color, women, and the LGBTQIA community. And the training should also discuss intersectional discrimination and how minority stress through discrimination is exponentially compounded, and the harm it creates to individuals, and not just the sum of its parts. And we also need to talk about and explain intersectional privilege, where it comes from, how we can use it for good, and why it needs to end. The training should also include reporting and support resources, as well as the descriptions for marginalized students, upstanders, and bystanders. For those who may repeatedly or even obtusely violate the standards of cultural respect and competency, they should be expected to remediate. And lastly, this training should be seen as an opportunity for growth. It's applicable to almost every interpersonal environment in the real world. It can be a source of individual growth and societal healing, especially for students who we know are more moldable and will carry the information with them longer. So thank you.
Thank you, Travis. We will now move on to our last speaker, and our last speaker is Fabiola Lopez, and she is an international student on the SIUE campus. Now, we were having some tech problems earlier with technology with Miss Lopez. We're going to try this. Now, if her tech doesn't work, she has sent me her comments on the side, and I will read those out to you, but we're going to go ahead and first try and see whether we can make this work. Fabi, are you on there?
Yes, I'm on there.
Still having the same problem, Fabi. So you may need need to mute yourself because we're still having that sound problem. So what I will do is she has sent me her thoughts that what she was going to share with all of us today on the side. So I will pretend that I am her or she, and I will read those thoughts out to everybody here. So this is what Fabi says. Hello. My focus is on international students here as members of the SIU family. The importance of she wanted to talk about the importance of learning from each other's background and history, and how this can mark progress. By doing this, we can mark progress towards slowly dismantling racism. And she thinks it's important to continue having conversational meetings or club mixers, not only with our students that were born in the US, but also be inviting and promote for our international students so that this can bring unity within our universities. Having civil respect towards and standing up for our international students can bring confidence to these international students and help them engage in events hosted in our schools, and I'm trying to read this. She said, however, due to the pandemic going on, we do not do a lot of these activities in person. Yes, that is, a situation right now, but she says we can host events via Zoom so that our international students are encouraged to participate in meetings being hosted by clubs. She is the president of the SIUE International Student Council, and she says, my experience with club members would be constantly hosting meetings and with other international students and gaining ideas on how these events can be more frequent. So thank you, Fabi, for sharing those thoughts about how important it is for international students on all our campuses to also feel welcome and included in the SIU family. So we're sorry we couldn't have you on in person today because of the sound issues, but once again, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. So with that, we are done with our short presentations here today, and we have had some questions that have been coming in. So thank you again to our audience members for sending those questions in for our panelists. And I will go ahead and start with the first question. And this first question is, and this might be a question for our leaders at who are working as deans or chancellors for diversity and inclusion at the different campuses. So this could be Dr. Brown, Todd Bryson, or Dr. El Amin. It could be either one of you who might want to take this on. Question is, what can the average worker, now today we've been focusing on importance of leaders and in being engaged with dismantling systemic racism. But the question here is, what can the average worker, which is the average staff person, I suppose, or faculty member, do to help achieve the goal of systemic racism within an institution? So did any one of you want to take that on?
I can start us off in this conversation. I actually think that the average worker has a profound capacity to make a change because they have different lenses than what people have who are working on policies. We need to hear those voices. We need to understand what's happening. So for example, at the medical school, what's happening with our frontline staff when they're interacting with patients, when they were coming in. If we don't have an idea of what's happening with them, then we can't make the policies and the changes from there. I think everybody really needs to look at what their sphere of influence is and to change the dialogue. When we think about it, most of the time when people are having a conversation, it's with people sometimes that look just like them. I think that they have to reach out and go outside of their circle and be very intentional to make sure they're becoming proximate to other situations. But unless we're hearing the voices of everybody, then we get very limited views. And that's why we have things like the equity response team to hear what's happening. We're starting to do focus groups. And I think that we need to make sure that we have people who are at all levels to be a part of that focus group.
Thank you so much. Did anybody else want to address that issue or question?
I would agree and piggyback on everything that Dr. El Amin just said, but I would offer there's no such thing as an average employee. When you think about what people have been doing over the last 7 or 8 months with COVID and everything else, boy, everybody's important here. So I would offer to the person who asked the question, there's no such thing as average. Everybody here is important. And so I think you can lead from where you are. I think your voice is critical, especially now more than ever. as we're going through some of the things that some of us have never experienced before. So I'm glad they're on the call, but I want to make sure they know they're not average.
I agree with Dr. Lane. I think that one of the things you have to look at is everybody matters. And most of the time, our staff is our front line. And the students see them before they see anyone else because they have the registration and all of that. And our, and so they are important. And I think one of the things that you want to look at is my philosophy in life is nothing happens outside of a relationship. So oftentimes you have to kind of leave out of your comfort zone, get to know somebody else, get involved in events that are happening on campus, get involved in professional development opportunities that we have. So I think you matter, and you got to know you matter, and you know that you're part of that community wherever you are. And as Chancellor Lane said, everybody's important. Everybody makes a difference. We're all in this together.
I also want to bring up something. We talk about microaggressions a lot, but we don't talk about micro affirmations. And I think that some of my greatest affirmations going through medical school were from the individuals that were cleaning, the individuals that were serving. And I mean, the entire ecosystem is what creates opportunities for people. So you never know, that piece of affirmation that you give to somebody helps them make a pivot to keep on doing what they need to do.
Absolutely.
I would like to add something there. There's an old phrase called, when you see something, say something. Make sure that you say something. There are a lot of things that happen that a lot of people go silent on. You have to make sure that you say something, because if you don't say something, nobody else will. You have to get involved. The other thing I would tell everybody to make sure they educate themselves. Make sure they understand what is going on. Don't just assume that that just happened just because that one incident. Understand, educate yourself to make sure you understand a lot of different ethnicities, people, everything. I mean, think about Dr. Brown just talked about Diversity Day tomorrow. Participate in that. Learn something about that. Educate yourself, to challenge yourself to learn something new. SIU Cardinal, we're having a Diversity Week next week. Please register for that as well. Go to diversity.siu.edu. However, what I want everybody to know is that they need to educate themselves, because if you don't educate, you won't be able to see something and say something. So I want everybody, like Chancellor Lane said, nobody's an average employee. If it wasn't for our building workers, if it wasn't for our civil service workers, we would not have a job. They're the ones that are the frontline employees on our campus. They're the ones, and I'll be honest with you, that keep our university going. So you are not average. So please don't think that you are. Everybody needs to be involved. Thank you.
So I would like to share that when we formed the Anti-Racism Task Force this summer, we started with a group of about 25 volunteers. And then we decided that we wanted to form 4 subcommittees. And so we kind of put a call out for volunteers and nominations. And within a week or two, we had over 100 individuals volunteer to be on the subcommittees. And the thing that I think to me was one of the most important parts of that was that we had conversations on those subcommittees, and people shared their unique life experiences. And it's one thing to hear about things, but to be part of a group and to hear what people have experienced, it was the most powerful thing to me about the task force. And I think hearing those things, those different perspectives, really changed a lot of hearts and a lot of minds. And so what can a person do? A person can volunteer and tell their story in settings like that. I truly think it makes a huge difference.
I was going to say, the topic I brought up was specifically related to the fact that any faculty member can be involved in looking at the personnel policies. I'm not actually allowed to go in and change everybody's personnel policies, and that's a good thing. I shouldn't be writing the personnel policies for the chemistry department or for people in the medical school. That's not my area of expertise. You have to have a certain amount of disciplinary expertise. I could advise on it, but I can't really change it, and nor should I. But really, that's a place where everybody can have an opportunity to get involved. And even all of those things I talked about as problems in the tenure promotion process, I only have thought about in more recent years because people have shared with me their experiences. So these were not things I came into my first position as an assistant professor and understood all of these systemic racism problems in our tenure promotion process. Is because people shared with me those issues. And once I looked into it, I realized that we do have some issues that we need to address. So again, that's a good one. And I think in almost any area, you're probably aware of policies that affect your work that could be changed, it could be adjusted, or maybe biased in some ways that I or others may not see. So again, kind of as Todd was saying, if you see it, tell us about it, and then we can start working on how do we change those policies.
Thank you so much. Those are great responses, and we will keep moving on because a lot of questions are coming in, and that's wonderful. Our next question, which I'd like to go to, and perhaps President Mahoney, you'd like to take this one on first, is there a way to ensure that all senior administrators have committed themselves to the lessons learned in the Dismantling Racism workshops in which they have participated? Learning these new strategies means putting them into practice. How are these practices being assessed or measured?
Yeah, and that's one of the things we were actually working on right now. So we've developed a long list of assessments that we're going to do that will not only do across this at the system level, but actually move down to the lower levels as well. So I'm a big believer in accountability. If we say that's a goal, and that's everything from looking at your success in recruiting diversity of faculty and staff, it may be looking at other aspects. It may be as part of their evaluation process, as we're asking people about how did they do as an administrator, asking questions specifically about how committed have they been to diversity, equity, inclusion, how have they demonstrated that commitment, and using that as part of an evaluation process. So I think there's lots of ways that going forward, we can actually hold people accountable for implementing the things that they've been taught and trained to do.
Thank you. Did anybody else wants to take that one and that question on? Or?
I will, just to piggyback again on that. One of the things that came from the system office was this diversity, inclusion, and effectiveness, really an assessment. Kind of a broad assessment that we've been charged with here on our campus to find the data that supports whether we've been doing it or not. And so for us, it's been a good exercise for the cabinet, for myself, as Dr. Mahoney said, to be accountable, not just to talk about this stuff, but to actually be accountable and to set some goals about how we can get better. And then monitor and find out if we're getting any better. And so it's actually a document our diversity task force, Todd, and his area are working on now that we have to give updates to, and very thankfully give updates to system about how well we're doing or progressing. And there's some areas we have some work to do. And I think that's the good part about those assessments is it tells you where you're weak in some areas, and it tells you where your strengths are and which you can continue to enhance.
Thank you.
So I think the concept of commitment by leaders, one of the things that we were actually dealing with today was that the subcommittees that I mentioned before from the task force, they actually came up with 78 recommendations, change projects. And so we were working through in the last 24 hours which administrators would help and be point people for making sure that those recommendations occur. And so that's really exciting to see people embrace those, adopt those recommendations, and seek to find ways to implement them.
Thank you. Did any of our other panelists want to address this? Well, okay, we'll then move on to our next question, and maybe I'll just move to this one since it's sort of tied to the one we just addressed. This one is, how about tying manager compensation to retention? This is kind of moving into the retention area too a little bit. We had talked about retention and the importance of, retention. We can recruit people, but if we cannot retain students and faculty and staff, then sort of spinning the wheel there. So how about tying manager compensation to retention and professional development? HR recruits, but then employees are either get stuck or leave. What are your thoughts on that? Did anybody want to take that?
I think I could say, having been in the role in a different institution for a while, that was one of the things we did look at. We constantly kind of monitored retention and across the institution. Sometimes it's retention of employees. I was thinking about athletics, retention of athletes. And we looked for patterns where we saw low retention and sometimes not just related to compensation, sometimes related to jobs. When we saw really poor retention, we moved on to someone else because that's usually a bad sign if there's not some clear rationale for why you're seeing that kind of turnover. So I don't think it's a bad thing to include that as part of an assessment of somebody. But yeah, I've been involved where we've looked at that and seen that as clearly a problem where they were having retention problems with staff.
Thank you. Okay, well, there's an interesting question here, which I will bring up now. And it is, what if there is no agreement on within the institution? And here we're talking about SIU, right? What is if there's no agreement on what systemic racism is? Then what do leaders do with that? And who wanted to go for that one?
I'm always willing to go first, but I'm also willing to let somebody else take it first. But, I think Ms. Hurst, when she presented, I think gave a good assessment of how to deal with that. Is you're never going to have 100%. I actually followed an administrator at one of my previous institutions who was famously said, well, if not everybody can agree, we won't do this. Well, if you go with that, you're never going to do anything because you're never going to get complete agreement. And as she was saying, if you get in a group of people and critical mass, I think she said was a 15% or something like that, of people who are in agreement and willing to do the work to make the changes, then you're in pretty good shape. And I think we certainly can have that, if not more than that. But I think, the idea that we have to have everybody agreeing on exactly what it is, I don't think we're ever going to get there. We need enough committed people in each area to be able to make some real changes.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Yes.
I just think it's less about agreement and more about understanding. It's okay to agree to disagree. And as the president said, we're not going to have 100% agreement. But if we can just have the conversations to try and understand some things like we're doing tonight, I think it goes a long way because you walk away with an appreciation for, I see your view, or I don't see your view, or I see your view and I don't agree with it, but we can do it respectfully. We can do it in a way that does not damage the culture of our institutions, where people can still work for the benefit of the students and not so much focus on themselves, because we're here for the students. So I think, it's for me, it's how do we get people to not agree on everything, because it's not going to happen, but again, how can we understand each of our perspectives and then how we got there? We all come from different walks of life and backgrounds, and we're not going to be the same. And so it's okay to agree to disagree sometimes, but still move forward.
I thought it was interesting that in the continuum that she presented, that stage 3, where people were managing, I think was the word that she used, managing discussions, it might appear that it's quieter or that it's okay, but she said that actually a higher stage, in stage 4, is where there's disagreement going on and discussions and maybe even arguments. And that is a better form of discussion because people are presenting their ideas and trying to get to a place where they can see different perspectives rather than just remaining quiet and being on completely different pages without anyone knowing.
I also like the idea that we're moving beyond just conversations and we're really looking at the metrics and we're focusing on the accountability. I know that in our field in medicine, when you start looking at the health disparities and you realize that because we may not be practicing culturally competent care, that people are not getting access and they're not getting the same medications. And when you look at those metrics, then that creates a different argument. And it makes it more visible for people to see that some of these decisions become life and death situations. And that's why it's so critical that at the School of Medicine that we are focusing on this and that we do have everybody on board, because if we don't have culturally competent, trained physicians, then that impacts the next generation in their health.
Yeah, and I think sometimes discomfort, engagement, as Chancellor Pembroke said, that engagement, I mean, all of those, when people are not comfortable, or when people are beginning to have a different opinion and argue, getting into that dialogue, that's engagement. So I take that as a positive. That means that you're moving in the right direction. That means you're engaged and you're listening to other people's conversation and you have an opinion and you're making sure that counts. So I think that's an engaged person. So I think that's good for us.
Thank you. Well, another question is, what reassurances can any of you offer? So I guess this is an open question for any of you from over here. What reassurances can you offer to members of marginalized group that despite increasing pressure from the current administration to move away from diversity, that we still are a priority? What reassurances can you offer? And this is an open question to any of the panelists.
I'll start. And I understand what the person was questioning. They're questioning the executive order from the president. And I will tell you, we have been told to go forward. We are not going to change the course. We've been told by our lawyers to continue, and we're going to continue. There have been schools, not just locally, but nationally, have decided they're not going to take that chance. But we are going forward. Think about it. We have Diversity Day at SIUE tomorrow. We have Diversity Week at SIU Carbondale. We're having this conversation right now. We could have stopped and said, you know what? We're not going to take that chance. We're going to we're not going to worry. We're worried about the financial part of this. Right now, it does not, in my opinion, it does not involve universities. It may come down the line, but I do believe that we are doing the right thing and we're going to continue to do the right thing as a system. If we were worried about those type of things, we would have stopped, but we're not. We're going to continue to go forward and making sure that, because we're not using the language that they were talking about in an executive order. So we've done some things that to make sure that we're not in violation. So we're going to continue to go forward. I just believe that's what the Chancellor, President Mahoney is telling us to do. Chancellor Lane, Chancellor Pembroke, all the CDOs on here. We're not going to stop. We're going to continue to do what we've been doing, and until we are forced to stop. But I don't think we will be. And even if we are, I do believe that we will figure out a way to make sure that we're not in violation, but still put the education out there.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson.
I would say this. I think that I'll say it in the words of my brother, we're in it to win it. And SIU as a system is in it to win it. So we won't give up and we will continue to build relationships, provide more information and educate our faculty, staff, and students so that we be the community and we be the light for the region that I know that SIU as a system can be.
Thank you. Did anybody else want to add some assurance and reassurance?
Well, from a medical standpoint, I feel very assured because the American Academy of Medical Colleges has come out with a very strong statement against the executive order and to put in alignment that the health care of the patients that we're trying to take care of, that we have to continue on this work and be in alignment with it.
Thank you so much. We are going to shift a little bit here, shift gears, and the question that came in here has to do more with professors in the classroom now. And the question here is, what role can individual professors play in the classroom to make students aware of what systemic racism is and how to dismantle it? Someone who's...
Yeah, I'll start and then let somebody else jump in. I think as a professor, it's certainly something I've tried to do in my own classes is just making sure when there's an opportunity, and depending on what class you're teaching, if you're teaching calculus, it may be a little bit harder to work in than if you're teaching a sociology class, but taking the opportunity to make sure that, and we had a good session last night at SIUE talking about anti-racism, and when one of the presenters was talking about, sometimes when we're teaching, say, a history class, most of the history was written by those in power, and most of it tends to be more white focused and more male focused. And as you're teaching a class, say, on history of a certain period of time, are you really doing as much as you can to look at all of the different perspectives and finding kind of those sources, maybe that, again, are not the sources everybody else is using. So students are being exposed to diverse perspectives on whether it's American history, European history, world history, whatever it is you're teaching, say in history or any subject. So certainly, again, I teach a class on intercollegiate athletics and its history. So I try to focus on making sure I talk about those issues of gender and race and everything else and how that played a role in the development and evolution of college athletics. So I think there's an opportunity in any class you're teaching to figure out how can I kind of make sure the students understand how this system developed and how it was in the past and how it is now.
Thank you.
I would say that, again, going back to the task force, one of the things that I've been reminded about is in a community of scholars, the things that people bring to the table as it relates to books that have been suggested, the video series that Dr. Brown mentioned before, articles. There has been no shortage in the last 3 or 4 months of things that people are encouraging each other to read. And I think that that's one of the strengths of the classroom of faculty is that they can recommend things for students to read that will provide a different perspective. So I think that our faculty are really good at selecting materials.
I agree and ditto both comments. And I think it's even when I teach, it's always about balance and making sure that I don't influence a group one way or another, but they have to find out for themselves, whether it's in the readings that I'm trying to get to them where they can see both sides of the equation. And that doesn't always happen. Even now, we're in the election time now. And here on our campus, we're really focused on making sure that no one is shut down, regardless of who they are for or against, but no one is shut down, and that you can have those balanced conversations where students can figure out for themselves without us interjecting our thoughts or philosophical beliefs on them. I mean, and this is what is so unique about going to college, is that they get to find that out for themselves. Yes, we get to help kind of push the envelope a little bit and get them to think outside the box. But I do believe it's important to have that balanced discussion when they're in the classrooms, and faculty have it, they know how to do it. And that's why our students come out doing so well. So I think that's a very important piece as we're trying to, make people aware of where they are and what's going on around them.
Did anybody else want to speak to that?
At SIU School of Medicine, we do have something that we call the Anti-Bias Curriculum Committee. And so we're in an active process of going through our curriculum to make sure that we are eliminating stereotypes that might have been present, to make sure that the pathology is not on one group. And I think that it's important for professors to also model that learning mindset. So sometimes if they have a blind spot, that they actually share with the class, this is a blind spot that I had, so that everyone's seeing that we're having that growth mindset. When that's modeled and that vulnerability, it opens things up for people to be able to say, we're all learning.
Well, maybe we can now move to Travis. Travis, maybe you can give us some insights from the student perspective on how you think professors could do this work a little better in their classrooms.
Yeah, so kind of to go off what Dr. Elamine said, I mean, having a committee go through and kind of comb through the curriculum and find these biases is really important. But also I think that having professors that are, willing to say it exists, first of all, is really important, but to also offer us all the information. And one example that I like to use, especially being a medical student, is when we get dermatology lectures, or even just flipping through like a dermatology textbook, how many of the pictures are of white skin and how many of the pictures are, skin of a person of color, and how much am I actually like getting to learn from that. And so to have professors that acknowledge those discrepancies I think is really important. And it can definitely offer not only an important like social learning point, but also just learning in general for our future careers.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Fabiola, I know we're having sound issues on your end. So maybe if you want, it'd be great, you could type something to me and your views on this matter, and I could read it out to everybody. So please, yes, she says she's typing right now. So we'll hear from her soon. But in the meantime, did anybody else want to address that while Favi is sending her thoughts to us?
I'll say just two things real quick while waiting on that. One is, back to one of the earlier questions is, what can the average person do? Again, every one of us who teaches has, a class or multiple classes. So this is something we can do as an individual employee. But also, I think Dr. Elamine and a couple others have said too, sometimes you have people who have greater expertise in this than you do. And so reaching out for help and saying, hey, can you look at my syllabus? Is there things I'm including? Are there sources? I've actually done that with my class recently. I think I'm missing some things. Does anybody know anything that I can add into this class to cover some of the experiences of other people of color and outside of African Americans, which I focus on quite a bit. So I think being willing to reach out to others is a good thing as well.
I think letting the students drive the curriculum sometimes is very helpful. Our marginalized student network was really helpful with getting us to do what's called a social stratification day, so that the students are becoming more proximate to the lived experience of their patients. So we'll be doing that this Tuesday. And if they had not said that, then we might not have made that navigation. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I recently did that with our diversity statement. I asked my class to rewrite the diversity statement that looked more like that they were in there. So take a look at our diversity statement. Did they see themselves? And so I had 20 students to rewrite the diversity statement to make sure that they saw themselves in that statement. And Dr. Pembroke, I'll be happy to share those with you.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm still waiting to hear from Favi, and I'll find a way to weave her response in later on, but we should keep moving on here. Another question came in, and the question is a more sort of a practical sort of question is, how do we report, sort of racism if we see it, some systemic racism? What are some of the ways to do that? And maybe Dr. El-Amin, Dr. Brown, and Todd Bryson, you can tell us about what we can, what ways there are available at each of the campuses to report this sort of thing. Dr. Brown, did you want to go first?
Oh, I'm happy. We have a bias, our BERT team, our bias incident reporting team. So that's one way. And even if you're not a part of it and you're a bystander, there's a clause in there for bystanders. So we really encourage anyone, if you see something, as I think Todd said or somebody else said, if you see something, say something, because we're in a community together. So we do have a bias incident reporting team, and everybody in our community is involved in it.
Thank you. Mr. Bryson?
I would say there's probably two ways. We have an equity office who has a website that they could report that on. But I would also tell them that they could also report to my office, which is the Office of Diversity. And they can, at the diversity.siu.edu, they can email us whatever they need to let us know, and making sure that goes to the task force. We have about 31 members on our task force. You can find their names on the Chancellor's website. So you can report to any one of those. So there's a lot of different ways. I will tell you that we probably have to do a better job of making sure that the whole campus knows of those ways. Because I'm not going to say every person on campus knows that, but we have to do a better way of making sure that everybody does. But there's a couple ways of doing that on SIU Cardinals campus.
Thank you. Dr. El-Amin?
We have the same systems in place with our equity response team, and we also have that more as a triage so that we can send people to the appropriate places that they need. We even have a place where students, if they see bias in the curriculum, they could actually add that and they could report that anonymously so that we can make some changes. And I think that what we did last year, we included on our employee engagement survey, we asked the question, have you experienced bias? And that was a way for us to get an idea of what people, one, considered bias, but then also what was the culture like? So I hope that when people have these surveys that come out, that they're actually reporting on them, because I think that it helps us to get a different lens that we need to be able to make the changes that are important.
Travis, could you give us a sense from the student perspective, what would be helpful to know from the student perspective about reporting racism from your personal experience? You can't speak for everybody, I know, but what are your thoughts on this?
Sure. I think what comes to a lot of students' minds is this going to come back to haunt me if I report this? So if I report this and a team or someone goes and talks to the individual, and I have to work with that individual, for the next month, or they're going to be teaching me for a semester, am I going to suffer repercussions from trying to do my due diligence? So I think as a student, I would want some sort of affirmation or confirmation that I'm going to be protected. And I know that can be, hard for, the administration to do that, especially if you're like taking a class with someone or something like that. So I would want to know what protections would be in place to protect me as a reporter for standing up and saying something.
I'm wondering if anybody wanted to address that part about, protection for students, or if you had any more insight into that.
I think that one of the things that I have found is that when things have been reported, that most of the faculty have been very responsive with just coming and wanting to engage in a conversation, because I think that people have been well-intentioned and they just had blind spots for the most part. So I think that one of the things that we're trying to do is that when these blind spots are brought up, that people have the opportunity to engage in a deeper dialogue with the person. And so that we really have that a space for people to have that learning that's important.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to weave Favi's response in here because she did type to me here about previous question here, the way we were talking about how can professors, help teach how can they better teach their students about what systemic racism is. And she says here, I agree with Travis for the most part, and an idea in his ideas about how professors can incorporate, systemic teaching about systemic racism into their courses, but she also thinks having it in the syllabus is a really good idea, having something in the syllabus, and that how the syllabus should say that there will be a zero tolerance for that sort of thing. And if any, if any professors know of any information or any resources in case some of us students are having doubts, to refer us to them, or even our professors can provide us with the contact info or email. So basically what she's saying here is that, just to be a resource or a person, a go-to person who can, given whatever situation is coming up in a classroom or for a student, to help them understand that better and supply them with the resources, that might be needed, because it might not be possible to always know and put in the syllabus what, students might need. So that's what she's saying. Anybody else want to address the question about reporting racism or systemic racism?
I would say if students in their student life environment or residential environment, they need to know that the Dean of Students, Vice Chancellors for Student Affairs, they stand ready to take those same reports. So if you have your fellow peers are doing some things that are racist, things that we will not tolerate here, that can be handled in those offices through our Code of Student Conduct. So there's an expectation that, that's not an environment we want to have here. It's where people feel fearful or scared or intimidated. And so there are some remedies for that, that students can go to, again, as I mentioned, deans, Dean of Students, Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, and those individuals are trained to make sure that they carry through and investigate and get to the bottom of what's going on.
So Vanessa mentioned the bias incident response team at SIUE. And I want to just add one thing to the comments, the good comments that other people have mentioned. So like Chancellor Lane talked about, there are avenues that things can be reported and that can lead to investigations. So we want things to be dealt with. But there is a human part of this. When people do that reporting, sometimes they feel vulnerable. Sometimes they have been through some difficult moments. And so in addition to the people who might investigate something, there are also professionals on campus. I'm thinking of people who offer mental health counseling, for example. So I just want to make sure that the students understand that we want to help, not only in just hearing the complaint and dealing with that, but also helping the individual who has suffered in some way as part of that incident. So I really hope people will come forward, and that allows us to point people to resources that can help.
I also want to mention that for faculty and staff, oftentimes, I mean, I know the question was about students, but for faculty and staff who may be experiencing some of this too, we have our Office of Equal Opportunity and Access. And that's at SIUE is Jamie Ball, where you can go to that office and talk about any issues of discriminatory or biases that you might be facing, that you would want somebody. That's another avenue that might be available to faculty and staff.
Thank you so much for your responses on that. Did anybody else want to address that? Well, there's an interesting question. This is an intriguing one that came in. It's short but intriguing. Should dismantling racism in a system be done quickly or slowly? Who wants to go for that one first? Quickly or slowly? I mean, sorry, no, quickly. Yeah, quickly or slowly. Yeah, I got that right. Mm-hmm.
So the theme of our task force this summer was the fierce urgency of now. And so it feels to me like the answer is quickly. We should be dealing with it because it is an urgent issue. I'm also reminded that this task force, we started working in June and we made our recommendations in October. So and maybe that's light speed by normal university procedures, but I feel like we never can quite get there as quickly as we want to, but I think people are working very hard to try to make changes now. There seems to be this critical point in time, critical mass. It feels like this is the moment to me.
I'd echo that, and I'd use two different terms instead of quickly or slowly. I'd use consistently and in a way that we can sustain it. Because just because we change a policy or a procedure doesn't mean that it's going to change everybody overnight. It's a culture that we have to change. So I'd use those two terms as we think about, yeah, we want to move with speed, but knowing that we've got to bring everyone along, and that could take some time. So if we can be consistent in our efforts and try and sustain these things by assessing what we're doing and finding out if we're making any progress, I think that'd be more of a lens that I'd operate from.
Dr. Barton, I agree with Chancellor Lane and Chancellor Pembroke. Some things we can move very, very quickly on. Not everything we can move very quickly on. And to understand, like Chancellor Lane said, we have to assess it. Some things we can change right now, but it's going to take us maybe a year to assess it. I go to the assessment that Chancellor Lane mentioned that we got from the system, the DEI assessment. There are some things that we need to fix, but we have to go find the data to fix them. So some things are going to happen quickly. We can start working on some certain things, but then we're also going to have to access them. So it's going to take some time, but we need to do it now instead of later, because as Chancellor Lane said, we have to be able to sustain this. As you know, in higher education, we have a lot of meetings, we have a lot of conversations, but we all walk out there, what was the action? And there was no action. So we want to make sure that there's action when we have these assessments and all those things so that we can access them and sustain them for later. I mean, I understand the question, but it's not going to move that quickly, but it's something that we have to look at quickly and start working on quickly, and then be able to sustain it. And it's going to take time to do those things.
Yeah, I'll say both. So I think it's I mean, there's some things that we can do quickly, and I think Chancellor Lane brought up the test blind scholarship program that they instituted at Southern Illinois University Carbondale this year. We just talked about that a couple months ago. So that's, I mean, for universities, that's really light speed to move forward to something like that as quickly as we have. I talked about revising the personnel policies. I don't think I've ever been at an institution that did that in less than a year, even under the best of circumstances. And so that's probably not something that's going to happen overnight. However, we probably need to start quickly on making progress. I think back to Todd's point of starting to make progress, starting to move beyond simply a discussion and kind of outlining some steps to our goal is to complete it by X amount of time, but understanding it's not going to move, that's not going to move as quickly as some other things.
Yeah, I agree. I think Dr. Pembroke talked about from our anti-racist group, we ended up with 78 recommendations. Well, what he said is we're not going to say we're going to get to all of them eventually one day. But what we're going to do is we're going to start with small, what we can do right now. And then little by little, consistently, as Dr. Lane said, consistently, we're going to, we'll be able to get to all of them. But this is an ongoing process. This is a new way of doing things. And this is now a part of our fabric. This is our commitment to be consistent and sustainable. So I agree.
I just wanted to add one thing. I think that we're going to have to be innovative with the approach. So one of the things that we're looking at doing, instead of people coming out to do a full day or a 2-day training, are there ways for us to do incremental training? So if we already have a faculty meeting, can we do a 15-minute topic discussion and a discussion around a case? For example, we asked the question, when was the last time you interrupted bias? And just changing the dialogue within a faculty meeting or an executive committee that's already happening. So this is a way for us to create those little boluses to have the sustainability that we need, but also it helps us to build things up and we're getting it started. So a lot of times people use the excuse, I don't have time for a training. Well, we're going to end up bringing it to you and training inside of the faculty meeting.
Yeah, and I think tapping in on the resources already on our campus. There's a lot of people who've been doing this work and a lot of people committed to it. So just really tapping in everything, we don't have to go outside and get, but just tapping in on the resources and the commitment of the community to be a part of this whole change process.
You actually, Dr. Elamine, you mentioned something which ties in with another question that came in, and this is related to training, and especially in environments, where training we cannot is not anti-racism training is not mandatory. How do we provide incentives for white people to engage an anti-racist agenda when the process may well be painful for them?
Anyone else want to take that one first? I think that sometimes helping people to understand what's right. So for medicine, it's a little bit easier for us because when people realize that you are not providing the right quality of care, if you're not looking at culturally competent care, then it gives you greater impetus to do that. One of the things that we're learning more, we recently did some of us did a program on Racism 101, helping people sit through the discomfort. I think sometimes we have to help train people on what to do when you're feeling discomfort and how to help them move through that. So I think we need to include that as a part of the training. It's hard for people to get their blind spots shown. Many individuals have done the implicit association test. And the first time they did it, they were like, oh, no, this isn't right. No, over 4 million people have done this, and Harvard created the test and they have standardized this and they have looked at this. And this is what it shows. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It just means that you have been a part of this society where you've absorbed certain things. So now that you are aware of this, how can you make some changes so that those red flags are not making decisions in the admissions office? They're not making decisions in your patient's office. So I think that we just have to kind of slow down a little bit and have multiple entry points. I mean, some people need a book club. Some people need a whole training. Some people need different things. And the more we can have all of these different entry points, then people will find what's comfortable for them.
Also, and not being afraid to say it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's great to be uncomfortable. That's when change takes place. And I think oftentimes people are comfortable in their box. But when you begin to stretch that box and allow others inside, then you've got to make a change. And so that gets uncomfortable, because if I hear your opinion, or if I hear your voice and I'm actively listening to it, then I've got to make some change, because knowledge is power. And when people allow themselves to be open enough to change, then it's going to be uncomfortable, because it goes against everything that you've been socially and educated to believe. And one of the things when I was showing I showed the film Race, the Power of an Illusion to my students, they were upset that they felt like they wanted to feel guilty. They wanted to feel something else, but they felt like that everything I've been taught has not been inclusive of this information. And why wasn't I told? So they were uncomfortable, but they were also at a point where then I've got to change who I am in order to be able to embrace this new knowledge. And so I think sending the message that it's okay to be uncomfortable. Change requires being uncomfortable. We don't do anything different when we feel the same, and when we enjoy our own individual privileges. So I just think that it's okay to be uncomfortable, and we don't need to make an excuse for that.
Well, I don't hear anybody else jumping in. So did anybody else want to address the question? Well, I'll ask another question, which sort of comes at this issue of our students, and from a slightly, or even could apply to staff, faculty, from a slightly different angle. How can a university system such as SIU help ameliorate the impacts of systemic racism on students who have been affected by it prior to coming to the university? So in other words, what support structures are in place to help these students overcome past discrimination? And perhaps those of you who are working directly with the offices on the different campuses might be in a position to address that first. Mr. Bryson, did you want to address that one?
I will tell you, each campus has a lot of different resources to help students. I will tell you one initiative that it actually came from a student organization called the Black Affairs Council. They just presented to us, they want to offer 10 sessions to students of color at the health center for counseling. And they're going around asking for money, and it's something that we are raising money to help them do, because students need that mental health. And as you know, even with COVID going on, so we've got students on campus who are dealing with all this, with George Floyd, all these other things that are going on over summer. Now they're on our campus, and they're away from home, and they're online, and there's a lot of different things that they're dealing with. So one of the things we can offer is our mental health. We all have mental health practitioners on our campus. The other thing is we have resource centers that can help with our students. There's a lot of different things on our campus, resources on our campus to help our students. The thing is that we got to make sure that they're known. A lot of students walk around and don't know all of our resources. We got to make sure that they know about all of our resources, so that they can use those resources to help them. Even just mentors, being able to express your previous experiences with somebody on campus. If there's nobody on campus, it looks like you're not going to be able to express that. So we got to make sure that we introduce our students to people that look like them, who have some of the same experiences as them, so that they can be able to open up. So there's a lot of resources on campus, but we have to make sure that the students are well versed and well knowledge about those resources.
Thank you.
At the medical school, we recently hired a part-time person who you all met on the last conversation of understanding, Dr. Kimia Saraf, who is actually a trauma mitigation specialist. And I really do think that this is a topic that we do have to talk about. What have students experienced before they've come here? So there's a phenomenon even called the Stereotype Threat. I'm sure you all have heard of Dr. Claude Steele, and he wrote the book Whistling Vivaldi. And he called it Whistling Vivaldi because he says, as a gentleman was walking down the street, he felt the need to whistle this classical music so people would know that he was okay and that he was not going to do something to them. But when we look at being in higher education, this has an impact on how our students are taking exams, how they're feeling about themselves, whether or not they're going to approach a specialty, or whether or not they have a stereotype of that internalized feeling of, okay, well, can I do this? So I do think that we have to help our students unpack and deconstruct what their previous experiences are. Unfortunately, we've had many students who've been told by advisors, you'll never be a doctor. Well, they carry that with them as they are becoming physicians. So we have to constantly provide them those affirmations and the opportunities to know that, the sky is their limit. So I like the idea of almost assuming that people have gone through something before they got here. That's how they got here, and we're here to support them.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
I echo what both my colleagues have said.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We're sort of coming closer to the end of our time here. So I'm going to ask one final question here, and then we'll have closing thoughts from our chancellors and from President Mahoney. And that final question here is, what is the role of allies in dismantling systemic racism? Did anyone want to go for that first?
I love my allies. Was that the question? What is the role of allies? We need more allies. This is what Dr. Lane used the word sustains us, because you can't do this alone. I mean, I feel like if I have allies inside of the boardroom, if I have allies with my deans, it's one of the reasons why I stay here at SIU School of Medicine, because we do have allies in all places. And that's what sustains us. We cannot do this work alone. And I think that the thing that we have to empower our allies to do is just to ask, how can I help? What can I do? And for them to be willing to, take whatever we give them and move forward with that. And sometimes they see things in us that we're not able to see. So I think that without allies, we'd be in trouble.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Elamine. I think that I can't be in every room. Our chancellor can't be in every room, but that if our allies are there, then they're going to speak up for what we stand for as an institution. And so we can't make it, we can't do any of this without our allies. And so we need you. We want you to speak up, and we hope that they're in rooms that we can't get in, or rooms that we just don't have the time to go to. So we need our allies. You're very important.
I see them as being the body cams.
Yes.
Things change when you have a different visual, and there are people who are able to bear witness to what's going on. So the question is, what are they going to say when they see those different things? So.
Yeah, and I think okay, go ahead, Randy.
No, please go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say that I think a lot of our focus has been on internal allies and people within the system, within our universities. I would just say that there are some wonderful allies that we have external to our universities, people that live in the community, and they have been so supportive to me that when things occur, to be able to talk to people here, that's important, but to be able to have that other perspective of what it's like for people who are not in the university community, I think that's invaluable.
Thank you. Well, Travis and Fabiola, did you want to add something on allyship from a student perspective or from your perspective?
Yeah, so kind of to go off what others have said, I think there's a lot to be gained from being an ally, just from a perspective of learning. And then also there's something to be gained by teaching allies too. I think there's a communication there that's invaluable to helping this movement. But I think what I find to be really important to allyship is to amplify, not override voices. So to amplify what's already being said. And then I think also to validate those voices and to say, I believe you, and to say, I believe you, what you've gone through is not right. And I'm here and I'm listening and I'm ready to help.
Okay. Well, I asked Fabiola, I'm sort of doing this chat thing with her and I'm relaying her messages to you. So she says, I do have something to say. And Travis, as you were speaking, she says, never mind, he took my idea. So I guess Fabiola has something very similar to say from what you did. So thank you all. It's good to end with the student voices over here, but we're not completely done. What we do at this point is we ask for some closing thoughts, and we're going to ask for some closing thoughts from President Mahoney and our two chancellors today. So President Mahoney, would you like to go first, or how do we want to do this?
I think I usually go last, so let
You go last. Okay, well then how about Chancellor Pembroke? Would you like to go?
Well, thank you. Let me just close by thanking everyone who is on the panel, but also thank you for everyone who has been watching, listening tonight, and submitting questions. It's been a wonderful session. I'm just going to quickly try to hit on a few things that I think are important in the conversations happening at our university, and if they're helpful to people, that would be great. Let me start with something that Mrs. Hurst said, and that was the difference between intent and impact. I think that is just the key a lot of times to microaggressions, and people say things, they have blind spots, as we have talked about tonight, but to be able to come back to that and to try to understand how those things function, how they hurt other people, I think that's a key. So intent versus function, intent versus impact. I will also say one of the things we've been talking about is communication and communication hubs, and how do we get the word out about important stories, important progress that is occurring. We're talking about speaker series, how to bring people from off campus to speak at SIUE so that we don't lose this moment, that we continue to commit to the important conversations. We're talking about common readings. We think that that could be a great vehicle for continuing the conversations and having the authors come to campus. I want to underscore what we were just talking about for students, and particularly students who come who may have had some negative experiences. Are we creating those spaces? Are we creating those moments? Are we surrounding with people so that we can continue to have those inclusive conversations? Equity advisors is a concept that we're using within our academic units. So those are people inside those particular disciplines that can remind search processes of why diversity is important and how to have a really effective search. Cluster hiring, we haven't talked about that much tonight, but the idea of making multiple hires in disciplines so that we create cohorts and people can support each other. Campus climate survey, I think that's something that we all need to commit to so that we are gathering input on a timely basis to make sure that we understand what is happening and can address that. And with that, I'll just close with the two suggestions, two requests. Don't forget to vote and get a flu shot. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lane.
That's a good reminder there, Dr. Pembroke, especially the flu shot. I just got mine, so thank you for that.
Yes, thank you for amplifying that.
Yeah, I figured you like that, Dr. Elamine. Well, I'm just honored to be here with all of you this evening. This has been a great conversation. Panelists, we've got a lot of smart people here that doing a lot of homework to make sure our environments continue to get better. That's important. So I just want to thank everyone for their thoughtful and insightful contributions. We've heard a lot tonight, much of which is not just unique to the SIU system. I think you've heard a lot of different topics, and hopefully the responses to the questions were spot on. While they're not unique to us, they're still relevant for each of our campuses. And I really want to thank President Mahoney and his leadership. I want to thank Dr. Pembroke and his leadership. They're doing some incredible things at SIUE. It's just very refreshing to be a part of this and to be a part of this system where so many people are concerned. Specific to SIU SIU Carbondale, I assume the responsibility as a chancellor at a time right when close by where I lived in Houston, George Floyd, we were hearing about him being murdered. And he was a couple of blocks away actually from where I lived, is where he grew up. And so as starting here during that point in time, I guess that was a sign that we would have to do some work going forward. And so I'm so glad to be a part of the work that we're doing now. We started our Chancellor's Task Force on Diversity and Inclusion. We have an incredible group of faculty, staff, students, and community members that are really tackling some what I consider to be things that we really need to focus on going forward. They have recommended several things that really is going to be my blueprint to follow, laying the groundwork for improving the hiring practices. You heard a lot about the trainings for not only students, but faculty and staff as we go forward. We've talked a little bit about addressing those inequities associated with the ACT and the ACT test. That's because of the chip on my shoulder. So I'm so glad I'm at a university that has gotten beyond that and give our students an opportunity to dream and to think big. That's something that's really near and dear to my heart. Next week, we have our inaugural Diversity Week on campus. I know Mr. Bryson is excited about that, as well as our faculty, staff, and our students. So these are just a few things that we've talked about tonight that I hope, again, we can sustain. We can hold ourselves accountable to making sure that we do those things. And one of the taglines we've been running here at our university is, "It's our turn." And as you think about it being our turn, it is our turn now to step up. It's our turn to rid or get rid of the racism that exists, so we can have folks that can thrive in nurturing and promising environments. So I just want to leave you with it's our turn now. So thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Lane.
All
President.
right, and since I think it's an obligation to mention, I did have my flu shot as well, and it was a student from the College of Pharmacy at SIUE, and I had absolutely no soreness whatsoever. So we are producing outstanding students, best I've ever had. I first want to thank all the panelists for being involved with the discussion tonight. I really do appreciate your involvement tonight and really just your involvement in everything that we're trying to do. And I think it's one of the things I want to focus on a little bit is that nature of involvement and the idea that really a lot of people can be part of that critical mass. There's lots of ways of getting involved. I think we talked a little bit about the Dream Collective and some of the things they're doing. So they're putting together their events at SIUE. So it's a group of faculty coming together to do something. You can be part of something like that. You can just attend their sessions like I do often and learn something from that. We talked a lot about training, and participating in training is another way of learning more. So there's lots of opportunities to learn. We talked about Diversity Day coming up tomorrow at SIUE, another opportunity to learn. There's Diversity Week next week at SIUC, again, lots of more opportunities. So really there's not a lack of opportunities to learn. And we had the last question focused on allies, which I didn't comment on then, but I'll comment on now. I think, again, for allies, there's lots of opportunities to learn more. And I think anybody can be an ally. And I certainly have tried to be, whether related to gender, race, sexual orientation, disability, whatever it is. But I also recognize I have a liability in that I don't have had those experiences myself. So participating in training, listening to the experiences of others, all of those things help me to understand better and be able to help in better ways. And I always like to leave with a story of someone I worked with many years ago. We were doing a search at a senior level position, and this man was sitting next to me, very big man, and we were talking about candidates. And one of the people said about this particular candidate that she was, and this was not race related, but gender related, that we used to talk about her. She was one of the best administrators female administrators in the state. And he immediately called out and says, "Why was she one of the best female administrators? You devalued her by simply putting the female in front of, she probably was one of your best administrators." Because you're right, because I kind of narrowed it down. But his willingness to call that out wasn't his gender, it was a different gender, but his willingness to call that out made us think about her as a candidate differently. And I frankly didn't pick up on that at the time, but he did pick up on that. So there's an opportunity in every meeting you're in to think about, are we really giving everybody a fair shake? Are we really, is our biases affecting how we're even describing candidates in search processes, or how we're teaching our class? There's always an opportunity to learn and make a change and do better. So again, thank you for everybody who's participated in the panel, and thank you for all of you who joined us